Oh, we're going to get so deep in policy, but we're also going to talk about the only certainty we have in trade is uncertainty. And we're going to find out what that means for the American farmer as well as businesses and talk about global markets and how it's impacting you on the farm or you and your community or when you go to the store to buy something. I'm Paul Yeager. This is the MTOM podcast. This week, we're back to school. We're not talking about anything casual. We are jumping into trade. We're going to talk about the policy of the Trump administration, the Biden Harris administration. We'll also kind of look back a little bit with what has happened for farmers as they have tried to progress over years and years of dealing with governments and what their ideals are. So we're going to go to somebody who is now in the nonprofit or the policy side of things, who's been an academic, who's also worked in government. Gbenga Ajilore is the chief economist at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He's based in D.C., spent time in Ohio, but he's from California. So, of course, we're going to talk about what's the differences and similarities between those three places and what it means to food production. If you have any feedback for me, send me an email at markettomarket@iowapbs.org. Leave a comment, rate us, like us, share us, any of that's great. But now let's get into our discussion. Born in California, worked in Ohio and D.C. Any similarities between those three for you, Benga?
I think the way I think about it is that people all want the same thing, no matter where they live. And they just want to be able to thrive and live in healthy communities. And that's what I've noticed in all three places.
Have you noticed, let's talk Ohio and California specifically. You've educated there. Food production is a big, big deal in those two spots. How do they view food production in those two locations?
What is interesting in California, I think it's more separated between rural and urban, where if you live in urban areas where I grew up in, you don't think too much about where your food came from. You just know somewhere in the Central Valley. And in Ohio, it's a lot more integrated, and there's a lot more people who, I lived in Toledo, Ohio, another urban area, but people understood and people who came to the city, I taught at the University of Toledo, so a lot of people came from rural areas of Ohio to be educated there. And so they bring that kind of farm agricultural sector into the city. So there's a lot more integrated there.
Well, then help me see how that fits in with your role at Center on Budget and Policy Priorities.
So my job is chief economist at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and my focus is broadly looking at the trajectory of the economy, what's happening with unemployment, what's happening with inflation, economic growth, and so what has been helpful for is now with tariffs and what's been happening with tariffs and seeing how that impacts each of those things.
Yeah, I think you just hit the five topics we'll hit for the next 6 hours. So get comfortable, everybody. But before that, you've worked for USDA in what capacity?
So I was a senior advisor in the Biden Harris administration working at the Rural Development Mission area. So while we did a little bit of agriculture, we're broadly all rural. So housing, infrastructure, business, you think about high speed internet, you think about clean energy, did all those things, all of the above.
What has been the biggest takeaway from your time inside government to outside of it?
So my first biggest takeaway was that I knew nothing about government. It was my first time in government, and I just saw the breadth of what the government can do and how the government impacts everyone's day to day life. And then the second biggest takeaway was it's important for people to understand how the government can help, but not from a paternalistic where it's like, oh, we're here for you. One of the things that we try to do is we're here to help as a neighbor or a partner. And I think focusing government that way, I think was really important.
Do you get the sense? I mean, we know what the current administration view has been on government. They want it smaller, and I'm sure you've got friends that were there behind in USDA. What is different now with what your job was to what they're trying to do right now?
I think it goes back to that neighbor and partner thing where this administration doesn't see the government in that role. The government wants to kind of step out of it and let communities kind of work and live on their own. But one of the things is we're finding that that just doesn't work out where everyone needs a helping hand and everyone needs that partner or neighbor.
Let's put all those jobs, all those locations together. What's the current state of the rural economy in America?
The rural economy is struggling, and a lot of it is because government, I would say, hasn't done enough to support. And so I think one of the kind of best ways to see that is with clean energy. One of the things that we did in the Bias-Harris administration is pursue solar, wind, geothermal, all these projects to try to help rural communities actually not just, talk about climate change, but actually just save on energy costs. I remember there was this hog farm in Illinois where they got solar panel array and they were able to lower their monthly energy costs $30,000. Like they paid $25 just for the upkeep. And so there's a lot of stories throughout the country where small communities were able to benefit and also to help out in the environment. And so I think with the pause and the halting of solar and wind projects, which were a huge part of rural economies and way they were saving money, there's going to be a struggle there.
Even if government support doesn't isn't there for the next 3 years, do you think some of those projects, or at least ideas of having projects like that, will continue? And if they will, how will they look?
So I think people understand the importance of these projects. And while the federal government is stopping that, I think states and localities are trying to find ways, trying to tap into the private sector or the philanthropic sector to help push these, across the finish line. And even if in the next couple 3 years they're not able to get federal support, areas are going to try to think about, well, what can we do? What are creative ways for us to be able to finance these projects because it's going to help out the local community?
Well, you could argue that there doesn't need to be any help, or if the market is allowing it, or if the market's there, it will happen. Are either solar or wind mature enough that that can happen?
They are more mature than they were, say, 5 or 10 years ago. But when we talk about the market, a lot of times we say the market should support these things, but we only do it in certain sectors. So we talk about energy sector and the clean energy sector. It's like, well, if the market should support it, then you shouldn't have to have government. But if you look at the oil and gas sector, they still have subsidies and they've had it for like 40 years. So like what's, good for the goose should be good for the gander, right? And so we don't have kind of like that consistent argument there.
That's the argument that I've had made for the ethanol industry, by the ethanol industry, is that they always tout what oil and gas is getting for subsidies, so why shouldn't they? Why was ethanol not targeted?
I don't really have a good answer for that. I think one of the things is with corn industry is that there are strong supports for it, particularly in the Midwest area. And so I think there's just going to be a push for, and I know one of the things that we did in administration, we were looking at alternative uses for corn. So there was the sustainable aviation fuel, trying to find ways of being innovative with corn production. So I think, corn production has a strong support throughout the country. And so trying to find ways. And so that's why we probably see the support and then not the targeting of ethanol.
I had a person with Iowa corn at the Iowa State Fair a few weeks ago tell me that sustainable aviation fuel is, they have to have that. That is key for them. Um, how close were you before you left government that we were there, where that was going to take off?
So I think we made a lot of progress during our time, and I think there were some promising avenues, but it hadn't gotten quite yet to the point where it was like, oh, we now have this and we can use this, and then we can go scale. So there's like the two steps of first, can you make it useful, and can you actually, fly across country with it? And if that's the case, how do we make it scale? So then it's another alternative.
Well, let's go to commodity prices themselves. You and I have probably both read the Purdue sentiment over the years, and it seems that that thing moves up and down, and so do other farmer-based, ag-based, rural-based surveys. They always seem to be tied heavily to commodity prices. Is that the only barometer there is for the health of the rural economy?
Well, I think one of the biggest barometers is just, actual exports and imports, what's happening with those numbers and what's happening with those sectors. So sentiment is very important because we want to understand how farmers feel. If they're feeling really good, they're going to be, not more productive, but they're going to be more supportive. And then if things are bad, then they're actually going to pull back, and that actually does translate into behavior. But we want to see, well, what's happening with exports, what's happening with export economies, and that's why we're so concerned about global trade and what's happening with other countries. When there are things happening in other countries, that has an impact on our farmers. And the same thing with imports. Are we able to bring stuff in? Do we even want to bring stuff in? And asking those questions, and then that also factors into farmer sentiment. And I think the one other thing when we talk about exports and imports, it's not just about final goods. Intermediate goods are very important too because a lot of farmers they import a lot of their inputs, and so as those fluctuate, and actually, tariffs have an impact on that. That's going to impact their sentiment.
Tell me more about intermediate goods. How do you define them?
So we look at just goods that you use to produce. So farmers, they use fertilizer, a lot of chemicals. They have tractors. They build fencing. They build grain boxes, and so all the things that go into that is going to impact their bottom line. And so when those go up, it makes it tougher for them to be able to maintain profits. And when those prices go down, they're able to produce a lot more, bring a lot more back, and reinvest in their farm.
Global trade. Good deal for American farmers?
So that's a very tough question to answer. A lot of it because it's going to depend. And so there's global trade where we are have a huge export economy, and there's global trade where we import a lot. And so it's going to depend on those, depend on the farm, depends on farm size. And so, as an economist, and back when I was at the University of Toledo, you teach Econ 101, and you say, oh, well, trade is good and it benefits everybody. All, it benefits everybody as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
and then we talk about individually who benefits, who loses, and then with who loses. And I really hate that kind of frame, but it's like, okay, well, economists who usually don't speak English talk about how do we compensate the losers, which is such a bad frame, and which is kind of one of the difficulties in talking about trade. And so when we look at try to figure out is global trade good, is are we competitive? And competitive for consumers, competitive for businesses, and competitive for the economy. And that's why when we talk about trade and we talk about tariffs and we talk about trade relationships and partnerships, then we get into the question of like, is this trade good? Is this trade fair? Are we doing the best for everyone in the economy? And then that's why when we answer the question, is global trade good? We have to look at these factors and then add it all up together.
But what's been the motivation for global trade? I mean, global trade's not. I mean, yes, we can go back to when Spain sailed to America and they were in search of other things and they wanted to bring them back. Trade hasn't always been fair. It's I don't even know, is it built on a fair principle?
It can be built on a fair principle. And so when I think about trade, is trade good? I think about coffee. We all drink coffee everywhere, but there's really only one place where we can grow coffee, and that's going to be in Hawaii. And the amount of coffee that we would have to grow in Hawaii to satisfy the demand of the whole country is just not possible. So then we want to engage in trade to countries that do have good environments and climates for coffee. And so that way we are benefiting because we are able to meet our demand, and we're supporting other countries in what they're producing. And so, and there, that's based on fair trade, where it's just there's something that we just can't do. And so, but there's another country that can do it. So let's trade, and and then let's benefit that. And so that's where global trade is good.
And but I'm going on the other side of that because I'm thinking about that's been a claim of the administration is why are we importing things that we can have in this country? They have been trying to blow up a lot of those, whether we're importing corn or beef from Mexico or pork loins from some other place where it's like we do that really good in the United States. Why are we bringing it in? Explain why or how that even happens or why it happened.
So I think a lot of that happens is we want to be able to support other countries, and so I have to be careful. I have to think of really have to state this really well. When we all do better, when we all do better. So countries that are struggling, and so we think about what we call, so-called third world countries. When they do better and they experience economic growth, we are all going to do better. And so some of it is that we can grow. We do pork, we do meats, we do soybeans, we do all these things really well. And prior to I'd say the mid 70s, 80s, we just were producing for ourselves. But the Department of Agriculture took a step, said, you know what, we can feed the world, and so we had our farmers produce a lot more. And so while we could be self sustaining, we also produce a lot to be able to send overseas. But at the same token, other countries can do that too. And so part of that is building a stronger global economy where you have, strong, stable democracies all across the country. And part of that's by supporting trade. When those economies do well, we have more stability there overseas and more stability at home. And so that's one of the arguments for pursuing global trade, as long as it's fair.
Just like us as consumers, Benga, I think of countries like China. They are not necessarily, it always appears that they are whatever's cheapest they're going to buy. Now, if there's a political ramification to it, or if they're forced to on a phase one trade deal, they'll do it. Is it all about price, though, on the global stage?
So a lot of it is about price. And so that's also part of the reasons why I engage in global trade is that we are always focused on price and providing the lowest cost for our consumers. And then businesses, want to be able to get the highest price and then be able to make a profit. A lot of times price can't be the only factor because then the question is why is the cost so low? And so sometimes the cost can be too low. And that's when we have to figure out, okay, is that where you start bringing in trade restrictions to be able to, again, it goes back to the fairness, it goes back to being competitive. And sometimes it's like, I can be competitive if I don't pay my workers. And it's like, and I'm going to be able to charge a cheap price. That's too high of a cost, right? And
And,
so you have, go
and
ahead.
we're seeing that high cost in a lot of things, not costs that you're referring to, but in the metaphorical sense.
Right. And so sometimes you have, countries that would what they call dumping, where they put in products at a under price because they know they can get, compete that away. And so that's when we have, what they call the Section 301 tariffs, where you're on unfair competition, where you do a study and say, okay, they are pricing their goods in our country at a price under cost. And so we're going to put tariffs on it so that for our farmers who are competing fairly are going to have a better chance. And so that's where you have trade restrictions coming in.
Are the tariffs from the Trump administration working for the good of America right now?
So to answer that question, you have to say, well, what is the ultimate goal? And one of the issues, because we've seen tariffs forever. We've always had tariffs and we had tariffs at different levels. But the question is, what is the goal? So sometimes it's about competition. Other times it's about national security. And one of the struggles that I've had with this current administration's trade scheme is I don't know what the ultimate goal is. They've mentioned raising revenue. So we just had the Republicans' mega bill where they, cut taxes and, people are worried about loss of revenue. And they say, okay, well, tariffs can uh, cover that revenue. And we've seen, large revenue from tariffs. But then they also talk about unfair competition. And so if you're putting trade restrictions to be more competitive, then if the countries respond to that and are more competitive, then that's a good goal and they meet that. But then you're not raising revenue because then the revenue goes because you take the tariffs off. And so I think it's hard to say whether it's good for America because we don't know what the ultimate goal is and we don't know when it's going to end. The other thing about this tariff scheme is that it just caused so much uncertainty in the markets where every day it seems to be a new tariff being put on or pause for 90 days has been put on. And it's just businesses and consumers are not able to adjust to that behavior. And it's also been going on for 6 months and there's just no end in sight. So there's no planning possible. Right now we're in the back to school season and, we're seeing higher prices. So we don't know how to adjust our behavior and how to find ways of saving money.
Well, who is paying the tariff cost? This revenue
uh,
that's being generated that you talk about.
it comes from consumers and business through higher prices, and that's why we're talking about before about it's not just about final goods but the intermediate goods. So businesses, so you think about farmers, there are tariffs on steel, aluminum, um, fertilizer, and they've been in for about a couple months. And then for those who are exporting, there's been retaliatory tariffs on that. So now they're paying more for their input costs. We see higher prices in clothing and apparel, some at grocery stores, rising prices there. So consumers are paying it. So all that revenue we're generating are coming from the consumers and businesses throughout this economy.
And so it sounds like that's being paid by middle and low income, not necessarily high income class.
Actually has been paid by everybody. The difference is what is it the share of your income. So it's a tariffs are a regressive tax. So lower and moderate income folks are paying a higher share of their income through these tariffs, but also higher income, folks are paying these tariffs too, for higher prices.
You mentioned the end goal. We're not sure what it is. What is strategy? And it takes a long time to get a strategy and a goal and to get things done. From being inside and studying things, how long should we expect that trade policy and deals should be negotiated? How long should it take?
Usually these take, upwards of months to years. And what usually happens is that you have, lower level staff, people who are career staff at these, Department of Commerce, Department of Agriculture, who are experts in trade, who then would work with the other countries and kind of talk about, okay, let's say we're talking about dumping. And then you would meet with the other countries' officials and say, okay, you guys are engaging in unfair trade and we want to stop that. And if you guys don't do that, then we're going to put these tariffs on, and tariffs of say like 20% or something, which prior to this year would have been an exorbitant amount, an
Hmm.
exorbitant rate. And the officials are hashing these things out, and then when you actually come up with the kind of the parameters or a framework for a deal, then you elevate that up to higher level officials, senior officials, and then the senior officials would then hash out the details and the discussion and say, okay, this is what a trade deal would look like, and it'll be hundreds of pages and all this legalese. And then that's when you'd bring it to the president, and then you would brief the president, write up a memo and say, okay, here's what this is, and this is why this is going to be a good deal, and why we think you should sign it. And the president, with their cabinet, would then talk about these things and say, okay, we're going to do this deal, and then there'll be an announcement. This is not happening. It's actually kind of the opposite, where the president tweets something, and then the officials, then it goes all the way down to try to hash out what that means. And so a lot of times you have deals done by tweet, and the problem with that is that he would say something, and then you'd have another official say, well, actually, I don't think we agreed to that. And then the other thing is, we actually haven't seen any documentation of any of these deals that they talked about. They talked about the 90 deals in 90 days, and then there were some deals here and there with some countries. But we, to this day, we still actually haven't seen any sort of documentation of an actual deal. So we don't know what is happening.
I want to get into the details in a moment. I want to go back to the process if we could. Uh,
Yeah.
how is it frustrating for those on the lower level to have something tweeted that changes weeks and months of work that's unfolded on an overnight statement?
I mean, part of it is when you work as a career staff, you understand the administration, you get a feel for the administration. And so when I was working on the Biden Harris administration, our secretary liked to do things fast. And so it's just like, this is something I want to get done, and I want it done in like 2 days. And so after a while, you just get a feel for what the administration is. And so I think the career staff here are getting a feel for the administration. They know to always check their socials or their emails at night or in the morning. And then you just figure out a way to adapt to that. Sometimes there are channels that you know where you want to be able to kind of have your voice heard. Again, you still, especially political appointees, you work at the pleasure of the president, but you also have expertise. You also know what you're talking about, and the career staff know what they're talking about. So what you do is you try to figure out ways to adapt, and then figure out ways of like, well, this is, I think, what the administration's goals are going to be, and so this is what I'm going to try to contribute to that. And so after time, officials are going to be able to figure out ways to adapt.
And how and when do we know if something that is done? Since we change presidents either every 4 or 8 years, how do we know that something's done in year 2 and 3 if it gets undone in 5, 6, and 7 because there's a new administration from when that thing was done? How do we ever know when a Biden Harris or Obama trade or Trump 1 trade policy deal has worked?
That's a great question, and I think a lot of it has to do with, is the next administration continuing that work or undoing that work? And so a great example is the tariffs on China, where the shift from Trump 1 to Biden actually kept some of those tariffs. And so really kind of push. And so I don't know the actual outcome, but a lot of it just depends on what was when that trade deal was done, what were the goals and the outcomes, and what were metrics, and then as it goes through, are we meeting those metrics, or did we shift them, or did we change goals and things like that?
Well, I hear often, well, Biden didn't keep doing what Trump had done with China, but you and I both know that there were a lot of things he kept in place. The Phase One deal is something that I keep hearing too. If Biden would have just held the feet to the fire, and we would have maybe been able to have more soybeans purchased by China. Is that a fair assessment of what happened?
I think that's a tough question to answer. And so a lot of it, because it's we talk about like the counterfactuals, like, oh, if you only did this, then things would have been great. And it's like, well, we don't know if that's the case. And part of it also is thinking about what's happening with soybeans is that, and we're seeing it again now, is that one of the problems in that first administration is that China shifted towards Brazil and to other countries. And so even, in negotiation, we said, well, you should, do some more soybeans. And they did. It wasn't back to the level before. And so one of the concerns then is, are we able to, what are the goals again? And then are we able to push China towards hitting those goals?
Well, let's just find somebody else to talk to. Let's talk to India. Are they ever willing to pick up the phone?
I mean, not this week. There's been a lot of the last week and a half. There's been a lot of issues with India, but that's the other problem with this trade scheme is that we've put tariffs on over 70, 80 countries, and of all varying tariff rates, and not with the strongest logic. And so it's one of those things where I think about small businesses who used to get their inputs from China, and when they put the tariffs on China, because we came out the gate putting tariffs on China, and so people are like, okay, well, I'll go to Vietnam, Malaysia, or Cambodia, but then we put tariffs on them. And then it's just like, you say, okay, well, what country can we go to? It's like, well, what country have we put a tariff on? And that's the kind of the question is that, I'm not sure what the alternative would be of a country that we're not tariffing.
Let me finish up with India. Have they ever been? I mean, they always appear to be that elusive market that nobody's been able to crack. Is that a fair assessment of India?
It is a fair assessment, and India always seems so ripe because of the population size. So it's like if you can get into the Indian market, I mean, that was why we went into China, 20, 30 years ago. It's like you're looking at, billions of people, and same thing with India. And so, but part of it is India understands that they have the leverage, and they know how uh, fertile their kind of area is. And so, but they've also, concerned about their own agricultural sector. And so I think a lot of the, you could say like hardball that they're playing with the US and other countries is that, well, we want to protect our own agricultural
Mm-hmm.
sector. And so, and we know how much you want this. So they, they have a little bit more leverage. And so they're able to kind of push back a lot more. And we've seen that, especially in the last week.
I've promised that we're going to return to certainty. So, the American farmer, I know we talk about quick responses and things like that. You plant a crop of beans, you plan to plant it all the way back in November when you start preparing the field. Then you do it actually in April, May, hopefully before June. You can't really change as the price changes up or down or because of a whim or a market has fallen apart. So, how can a farmer prepare for this current environment of trying to be in the right crop at the right time and hopefully get the right price?
I mean, you've nailed the problem on the head, that this is what's so difficult about uncertainty and why certainty matters so much. And so I would say, for farmers is like, what are your alternative markets? One of the things that we did at USDA was try to find other ways for farmers to be able to be successful and gain revenue. And so I think one of them was we had these regional food centers, and we had like local school, like farm to school programs to be able to say, okay, here are these different pockets of revenue that you can have, so that if the export economy is shifting or variable, you have other alternatives. Now, while some of that's been pulled, there's still probably other opportunities for revenue and generating revenue. And that's the kind of thing where, because again, you have your crop that you're going to produce, and that's because you've made these decisions all year long. So now where can you offload some of that? That's not just the export markets.
All right, put your academic hat back on. In academic land, we always talk about the abilities you have to think of things completely different. So what happens if we don't, like behind me, plant all the corn and all the beans in middle America and in the grain belt? And we do more vegetables or more cotton or more something else. Do we ever think that's going to happen?
So for that to happen, the incentives have to change. We plant a lot of corn, we plant a lot of soybeans because the incentives drive farmers to do that. And to be able to make that major shift, because that's a major shift,
Hmm.
is that the financial incentives, and part of it is you have to think about weather too. You think about weather is going to affect that and climate's going to affect that. Like there's a reason why we do corn in the Midwest and cotton in the South, right? So there has to be a lot of things that have to change for farmers to be able to make that kind of major shift. And a lot of that's just policy. Policy is going to direct the financial incentives in terms of what's going to be done.
Therefore, it's going to change every 4 to 8 years, likely.
That is true.
And it makes hard for I mean, and these farmers have been around for, in Iowa we celebrate, heritage farms, 150 years in the same family. There's been a
Mm.
lot of changes in policy over 150 years for some of these families. So I guess, as we get close to the end here, um, trade with fertilizer and herbicides and seed and outputs and markets, is there anything that an American farmer can look at to try to gauge where they can lead their farm and try to stay profitable?
I would say, I mean, getting back to your point about the 150 years, is that they've seen all kinds of ups and downs. And I think one of the things that I always, when I do these interviews, I always talk about is people don't understand the story, and the story of the, in this case, the story of farmers and what their, costs are, how they do things, what they need, what's been helped them make successful. Because then we see policy that goes against that. And so if people understood the story, when they see these policies, then they're like, that doesn't make sense because I know the farmer story. I know they need fertilizer and chemicals. I know these things are part of their cost. I know they have to make decisions in November, planning decisions in November, April, May, they actually have to put, seed in the ground so that come August, September, they can start harvesting. Like I understand that whole process. So when you're doing day-to-day tariffs, that makes it that doesn't make sense. And so, but people understand that story, then they can advocate on behalf of the farmer on these policies and to try to create certainty.
Any certainty ahead here in the next 2 years to 4 years, that we can count on?
Sadly, I'm not sure there's any certainty till tomorrow or Friday. You know, I can't tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. I can't tell you what's going to even happen the rest of the day. But that's why we just have to tell the story of the farmers and what they need and why they need this certainty to try to, press our policymakers to, have certainty.
So the only certainty is uncertainty? Do I have that right?
That is correct.
You can use that in your next one. How about that, Benga?
I will.
All right. I appreciate your time. Thank you for engaging in my crazy ideas. I always appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for watching. Get subscribed to that new Market to Market Insider newsletter. And I shouldn't say new because it's a year old already. That's kind of fun. Many of you have enjoyed that, or at least you tell me you do. So keep reading. You'll find out what's coming up on the future installment of this podcast first before anybody else. That's kind of cool. We'll see you next time. Bye.